Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nora, and today I'm here to share a story from my life, a story of hardship, hope, and transformation. It's a story that's very close to my heart, and I hope it inspires you as much as it has inspired me. So let's begin. From the very beginning, life had been a series of hardships for me. I was just a young girl when my mother passed away, and that loss left a void I didn't know how to fill. I was only 7 years old when my mother died. Her illness took her away far too early, leaving me with memories that I could barely comprehend at the time. I remember her soft voice, her warm embrace, and the scent of her perfume that lingered in the house even after she was gone. But most of all, I remember the silence that followed. The silence of a home without laughter, without the gentle hum of someone taking care of you. I didn't know how to fill that emptiness. At that age, I didn't understand what it meant to lose a parent. All I knew was that something was missing, something essential. My father, though present physically, was never truly there for me. He was distant, emotionally unavailable, and he struggled to cope with the loss of my mother. I often found myself longing for his attention, seeking his approval, or even just wishing for a kind word from him. But he was always busy, either working, consumed by his own grief, or lost in his own world. I was left to navigate my childhood without any real guidance. At a young age, I learned that the world wasn't always kind to people who had no one to rely on. It was a harsh reality to face, but it was one I had to learn quickly. My childhood was marked by solitude and a sense of responsibility that no child should bear. As a teenager, I had to become an adult before my time, taking on responsibilities that were meant for someone much older. I took care of myself, I took care of the house, and I even looked out for my father, though he never asked for it. I found myself cooking meals, doing the laundry, and even handling the bills, things that no one had taught me how to do, but that I knew I had to do. I learned to grow up quickly, adapting to the adult world, not because I wanted to, but because I had no other choice. I remember feeling so alone during those years, like I was living a life that wasn't meant for someone my age. There were moments when I would lay in bed at night, wishing I could be a child again, free from the weight of responsibility. But that was not the reality I was given. When I became a mother myself, I vowed to give my daughters the love and care I never had. The moment I held Emma in my arms, I made a promise to myself that I would never let her experience the loneliness I had felt. I wanted to be the mother that I had always wished for, to be the one who was always there for her, to guide her through life, to show her love in the ways I had missed out on. But as I soon discovered, being a mother wasn't as simple as I had imagined. I didn't have the role model I needed to show me how to raise my children. I was on my own, navigating this journey without any real sense of what I was doing. I had no idea what it meant to be a mother without my own mother to show me the way. I had to figure it out as I went along, and more often than not, I felt like I was failing. But no matter how hard it got, one thing remained constant: love. Love became my anchor. Despite all the difficulties, all the moments when I felt like I was failing as a mother, I loved my daughters with everything I had. I made mistakes, I lost my temper, and I had days when I felt like I couldn't go on. But I never stopped loving them. And in the end, I believe that love is what carried me through the darkest of times. I couldn't give them everything I wanted to, but I could give them love. And I believed that love would be enough. Raising Emma, Grace, And Luna was a beautiful challenge, one that tested every part of me. Emma, my firstborn, was the responsible one. From a very young age, she showed a maturity beyond her years. I saw so much of myself in her, and I feared for her, wondering if she would have to shoulder the same burdens I had. Grace, on the other hand, was full of life and energy. Her laughter filled the house, even when times were tough. She was the light in our home, and I often found myself grateful for her joy. Luna, the youngest, was my sweet little girl. She had a way of making me forget about the struggles of the day with her bright eyes and innocent questions. Each of them was different, yet each of them needed me in their own way. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the reality of our financial struggles. I worked long hours, often cleaning houses and offices just to make ends meet. It was exhausting work, but it paid the bills barely. There were times when I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I was going to make it through another month. The rent was always a looming pressure, and I would often go without meals just to make sure my daughters had enough to eat. I remember the days when I had to scrape together enough money to buy groceries, and I would choose the cheapest options just to stretch the budget further. There were moments when I felt like I was drowning, unable to keep up with the bills, the rent, the never-ending list of things that needed to be done. But I kept going. I kept working. I kept fighting, because I knew that my daughters depended on me. They were my reason to keep going, even when everything else seemed to be falling apart. It wasn't easy. There were days when I felt like I was failing as a mother, when I doubted my ability to provide for my children. But every time I looked into their eyes, I knew I couldn't give up. I had to keep going for them. I had to find a way to make things work. And so I kept going one day at a time, one step at a time. I was determined to give them a better life, one filled with love and opportunity. No matter how hard it got, I would keep going. I would never stop loving them, never stop fighting for them. Looking back, I realize how much I've changed. Those early years were so difficult, but they taught me the strength I never knew I had. They taught me that love is the most important thing in the world, that love can overcome any obstacle, any hardship. My daughters were the driving force behind everything I did. They were my reason to keep fighting, and they always will be. And so, as I reflect on those early years of my life, I can't help but feel grateful for everything I've learned. I've learned that life doesn't always go according to plan. I've learned that being a mother is hard, but it's also the most rewarding thing I've ever done. And above all, I've learned that no matter how tough things get, love will always carry me through. Raising my daughters, Emma, Grace, and little Luna on my own was both my greatest joy and my most difficult challenge. From the moment I found out I was pregnant with Emma, I knew my life would never be the same. But I didn't understand the depth of that change until I held her in my arms for the first time. Emma was the first one I ever had to care for, and I was determined to give her the best life I could, even if I didn't have the faintest idea of what that looked like. I wasn't just raising her, I was learning to become a mother, and I had to do it all on my own. The responsibility that came with being her mother weighed on me from the start, but it wasn't until Grace and Luna came along that I truly began to understand the depth of what it meant to raise 3 daughters on my own. Emma, being the oldest, always tried to step up, often taking on responsibilities that were far too heavy for her young shoulders. As a little girl, she would try to help with the housework, offering to clean up after dinner or organize Luna's toys. I could see the maturity in her, even when she was just a toddler, and understanding that she needed to help, to be strong, because I couldn't do everything alone. It broke my heart every time she tried to take on too much. She wasn't a grown-up, but in many ways, she felt like she had to be. I remember a time when she came to me, worried about how much food we had left in the fridge. At just 7 years old, she was already asking about the grocery budget, trying to save me from making hard decisions. It was a reminder how deeply she understood the gravity of our situation, and it made me feel guilty. She should have been playing with dolls, not worrying about how many cans of beans we had left to eat. Still, I admired her strength, her determination to help, even when it meant sacrificing her own childhood. Grace, my second daughter, was the complete opposite of Emma. Where Emma was serious and responsible, Grace was my carefree spirit. Her laughter filled our small apartment even when there was little to laugh about. She had this infectious energy that could lighten the darkest days. I often found myself watching her, marveling at her ability to find joy in the smallest things. Grace was always the one to pull me out of my thoughts when I felt overwhelmed. If I was sitting at the kitchen table, calculating how much I could afford to spend on groceries that week, Grace would run into the room, twirling in one of my old dresses and laughing, asking me to dance with her. She was the one who reminded me that it was okay to smile, even when the world seemed like it was crashing down around us. She brought color to a life that often felt gray, and I loved her for that. I just wish she didn't have to grow up so fast, too. Then there was Luna, our youngest. At just 5 years old, she was the little light of our family, the one who could always make me smile, no matter how bad my day had been. Luna had an innocence about her that was almost contagious. She was so young, yet so aware of the love that surrounded her. I remember when she would crawl into bed with me, her little hands clutching my shirt as she asked me to sing her a lullaby. It was in those moments that I felt like everything might be okay, if only for a little while. I would sing softly to her, her tiny face relaxing in my arms, and I would think to myself, I can't give them much, but I can give them love. Luna reminded me every day of why I had to keep going, despite everything that seemed to be falling apart. She needed me to be strong. She needed me to protect her, and I couldn't let her down. Each day was a balance of doing my best to provide for them, even though I had nothing to give but my love. There were days when I felt so drained that I didn't know how I could keep going. My body ached from the long hours I spent cleaning houses, and my mind was constantly running on empty. But I had no choice. My daughters relied on me. I had to be the one to hold things together. The constant financial strain was always there, hovering like a cloud. Every month felt like a struggle to make ends meet. The rent was always looming over me, and there were days when I couldn't afford to buy food. I would go without eating just so my daughters could have something to fill their stomachs. I remember one evening when I didn't have enough to buy anything but a loaf of bread. I split it into 3 pieces and gave each of them a slice, hoping they wouldn't notice the lack of variety in the meal. I could see the disappointment in their eyes, but I smiled and told them it was a special treat. I couldn't let them see me break. Even though I was breaking inside, there were times when I had to skip bills or delay payments just to put food on the table. I would make deals with the landlord, asking for a few more days to pay the rent, knowing that I was barely keeping up. Sometimes I would call the utility companies and explain that I couldn't pay the bills on time, hoping they would give me an extension. Every month felt like a race against time, a constant balancing act. I had to make decisions I didn't want to make, choices that hurt me but were necessary for survival. It was a burden I carried quietly, one that weighed me down with each passing day. But no matter what, I never let them see me break. I put on a smile, did what I had to do, and kept pushing forward for them. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I wanted to scream, to let out all the frustration and fear I was holding in. But I couldn't. I couldn't afford to show them how hard it was, how much I was struggling. I had to be their rock, their foundation. I had to be the one they could count on no matter what. So I kept going, one day at a time. Every morning, I woke up with the same determination. I would find a way to make it through. I would find a way to give them a better life. In the evenings, after the cleaning jobs, I would come home exhausted, but I always made sure to read them stories before bed, to tell them how much I loved them. I couldn't afford to buy them toys or take them on outings like other families, but I could give them my time. I could give them my love. And for me, that was enough. There were nights when I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if they would grow up to resent me for not being able to give them more. But then I would hear one of them stir in their sleep, and I would remember why I kept going. I was doing the best I could, and I was doing it for them. I often wondered what their lives would have been like if circumstances had been different. If I had the support I needed, if I had more money, if I didn't have to work 2 jobs just to keep the roof over our heads. But then I would see their smiles, their laughter, and I would know that no matter what, I was doing the right thing. I was giving them the one thing that mattered most, love. Raising my daughters alone wasn't easy, but it was the most rewarding thing I've ever done. They were my reason to keep fighting, to keep striving for something better, even when the odds were stacked against me. They made every sacrifice, every struggle worth it. And as I look back now, I can honestly say that, despite all the hardships, I wouldn't change a thing. They are my greatest gift, my greatest accomplishment, and I will continue to do everything in my power to give them the life they deserve. Being a cleaning lady was far from glamorous. It's a job that many people overlook or take for granted, but for me, it was a lifeline. It wasn't a profession I had dreamed about as a child, and it certainly wasn't the future I had imagined for myself. But it was the only work I could find, and I knew that if I wanted to survive and provide for my daughters, I would have to give it everything I had. I didn't have the luxury of working for an agency or having a steady job. I had to find my own clients, one house at a time, one office at a time. It wasn't easy, and it often felt like an uphill battle, but I kept going because I had no other choice. I carried my own cleaning supplies, buckets, mops, brushes, cleaning solutions, everything I needed to do the job right. It wasn't just about sweeping floors and dusting tables. I had to scrub toilets, polish windows, and wipe down kitchen counters. Some days I worked in homes where the dirt and grime were so thick that it felt like I was fighting a losing battle. The messes I had to clean up were often more than just physical. In some places, I was cleaning up the remnants of people's lives, forgotten dishes, spilled wine, abandoned toys, and broken furniture. Sometimes it felt like I was cleaning up their mistakes, their chaos, and it wore on me mentally and physically. But I couldn't afford to be picky. I had to take what I could get. I spent my days knocking on doors, trying to convince people that I was reliable, hardworking, and trustworthy. Some days it felt like no one was listening, like no one cared enough to give me a chance. There were plenty of doors that were slammed in my face or left unanswered, but I never gave up. I kept trying, kept showing up, and kept hoping that one person would give me a chance. It wasn't easy to sell myself, to ask for something I didn't feel like I deserved, but I did it because I had no other choice. I needed the work and I needed the money. It wasn't about pride. It was about survival. Most days I cleaned homes and offices for barely enough to cover rent, but I didn't care. At the end of the day, it wasn't about the money. It was about providing for my girls. I didn't want them to go without, didn't want them to feel the sting of not having enough to eat or enough to wear. I worked in places where I could barely stand up straight by the time I finished, but it didn't matter. All that mattered was that I had done my best, that I had given everything I had. No matter how little it was. My back ached from bending over toilets and scrubbing floors. My hands were raw from washing dishes and wiping down counters for hours on end. The skin on my palms was cracked and sore, and I would often soak them in hot water at night to try and soothe the pain. My body felt like it was constantly breaking down, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to stop. I had 3 daughters who needed me to keep going, and I couldn't let them see how much I was struggling. I didn't have the luxury of complaining about being tired or aching or overwhelmed. I just had to push through it all. There were times when I was so exhausted that I could hardly keep my eyes open. My body begged me for rest, but I couldn't afford it. The bills didn't stop, and neither did the work. There were nights when I would crawl into bed, my muscles sore and my mind racing, only to wake up a few hours later to do it all over again. I was running on empty, but I didn't have a choice. If I stopped, if I took a break, everything would fall apart. I couldn't afford to be sick, tired, or anything less than what they needed me to be. I had to be strong for my daughters. I had to be strong for them because they were counting on me. They depended on me for everything: food, shelter, love, and if I didn't show up, who would? I learned to push through the fatigue, the aches, and the feelings of hopelessness. Some days I felt like I couldn't go another step. My body was physically drained and my mind was overwhelmed with worry. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I was going to make it through the next day. How was I going to pay for the bills? How was I going to buy enough food to feed my daughters? I couldn't give up. I didn't have the luxury of quitting. But some days I just wanted to. I wanted to sit down and cry, to let the weight of everything I was carrying crush me. But I couldn't, not for them. They needed me, and no matter how hard it got, I couldn't let them down. Some clients were kind, and some were difficult. I would walk into homes where I was treated like a servant, where people didn't even acknowledge the work I was doing. I would smile, nod, and do the work, but inside I felt my self-worth eroding. The work was hard, the hours long, and sometimes the clients were ungrateful. I remember one particular house where I spent hours cleaning, only for the woman to complain about something so small it felt ridiculous. She picked apart every little thing, and when I left, I was exhausted and disheartened. I had given my all, and it felt like it wasn't enough. But no matter what, I still had to keep going. The next day, I had to wake up and do it all again. The bills didn't care if I was tired. The rent didn't care if I was discouraged. And the world didn't stop for me to rest. So I kept working. I kept cleaning, scrubbing, wiping, because it was the only way I knew how to survive. On the good days, I would have a client who was kind enough to thank me, who recognized the hard work I was doing. Those small moments of appreciation meant the world to me, and they helped me keep going when things seemed impossible. It wasn't much, but it was something. Those moments were like little rays of light in the darkness, reminding me that I wasn't invisible, that my work mattered. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't easy, but it was real. It was survival dot by the time I got home each night. I was so tired I could hardly think straight. My back was sore, my hands were swollen, and my body was telling me it had reached its limit. But I couldn't stop. I had to make dinner for my girls, help them with their homework, and get them ready for bed. I couldn't afford to be exhausted in front of them. They didn't need to see how tired I was. They didn't need to see how much I was struggling. They needed me to be their mother, their protector, their provider, and so I kept going. Every day I woke up and did it again. I worked because I had to. I worked because my girls needed me to. There were days when I felt like giving up, days when the weight of everything was too much to bear, but I never did. I pushed through. I worked through the pain, through the exhaustion, through the discouragement, because they were counting on me. I couldn't fail them. I couldn't let them down. So I kept working. I kept surviving. For them. That cold, rainy night when everything changed, it felt like the world had come crashing down all at once. I remember that evening so vividly, as though I can still feel the chill of the rain against my skin. It had been a long, exhausting day. Another one of those endless shifts where I barely had time to catch my breath, let alone rest. The fatigue in my bones felt heavier than ever. I had just finished cleaning another office building, my back sore from scrubbing floors and wiping down surfaces. My hands ached from gripping the cleaning supplies, and my mind was foggy, desperately craving the comfort of my own bed. But despite all that, I had to keep going. For them. My girls, Emma, Grace, and Luna, were waiting for me at home, and I still had to walk them back from the office. They were my reason for pushing through the exhaustion, my reason for doing everything I did. The streets were slick with rain, and the night was darker than usual. The sound of the rain pounding against the pavement was deafening, and the wind cut through me like a blade. I pulled my coat tighter around me, trying to shield my daughters from the cold, but the rain was relentless. Emma, the eldest, kept walking ahead, her pace quickening as she tried to shield herself with the small umbrella we had. Grace, always full of energy, skipped along beside me, humming a little tune, her laughter light despite the heavy rain. And Luna, my baby, was clinging to my side, her small hand gripping mine with the kind of innocent trust only a child can have. Her tiny face was so full of wonder, looking up at the lights reflecting in the puddles dot as we walked along that familiar path. My mind was elsewhere. I was tired, my thoughts racing as I tried to think about how I would manage the bills, how I would get enough food for the week, how I would continue to keep things together for my daughters. I had no idea that this seemingly ordinary walk would change everything. We didn't see the car coming. I don't even remember hearing it until it was too late. One moment, we were walking along the sidewalk, just trying to get home like we always did, and the next, it felt like the world came crashing down in an instant. The sound of screeching tires, the sudden impact, everything happened so fast. I didn't even have time to react. 1 second, I was walking with my girls, and the next I was on the ground, unable to move. The sharp, excruciating pain in my leg was unlike anything I had ever felt before. It felt like my leg had been crushed under the weight of the car. I remember the cold, hard pavement pressing against my body and the world around me spinning. I could hear my daughters screaming, their voices filled with panic and fear, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. The pain was all-consuming. The paramedics arrived quickly, their voices a blur as they rushed to stabilize me. But in that moment, I felt like my life was slipping away. I was aware of everything happening around me, but at the same time, I felt disconnected, like I was floating outside of my own body. I could hear the sirens, feel the cold air around me, but my mind was somewhere else, somewhere dark. I had never felt so vulnerable in my life. For the first time, I felt truly helpless. I couldn't protect my daughters, couldn't make sure they were okay. I could hear them crying, but I couldn't comfort them. I wanted to hold them, to tell them that everything would be okay, but I couldn't move. I couldn't even lift my arm, Dot, when the paramedics lifted me into the ambulance. I felt like I was being pulled away from everything that mattered. My daughters were there, standing on the sidewalk, tears streaming down their faces as they watched me being taken away. Emma was holding on to Grace, trying to comfort her, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Luna was just staring at me, too young to fully understand, but feeling the absence of my presence in a way that broke my heart. I wanted to scream for them, to tell them I was going to be okay, but the words wouldn't come. All I could do was lie there, my body broken, and my heart shattered. When I reached the hospital, the doctors told me that my leg was broken in several places and I would need surgery. The pain was unbearable, but I could barely focus on it. My mind kept drifting back to my daughters, to the devastation in their eyes. How could I be their mother if I couldn't even take care of myself? How could I protect them if I couldn't walk? The physical injury was only part of the problem. What really hit me, what really felt like a punch to the gut, was the realization that my life, the life I had built for my daughters, was falling apart. Without the ability to work, I knew I wouldn't be able to care for them. I had always relied on cleaning to make ends meet, and now I was unable to do that. I would be out of work for months, maybe longer. How was I going to pay the rent? How was I going to buy food? And then there was the debt, the $20,000 I owed for the damage I had caused to the luxury store. The thought of that debt felt like an anchor around my neck, dragging me deeper into despair. I had never been in debt like this before, and I had no idea how I was going to pay it off. The financial pressure, combined with the uncertainty of my recovery, made everything feel like an impossible weight. The fear of losing our home, the fear of not being able to provide for my daughters overwhelmed me. I had worked so hard to make sure they had everything they needed, and now it felt like it was all slipping through my fingers. I didn't know how to face the future anymore. Every plan I had made for my daughters, every goal I had set for us, felt like a distant dream. How could I rebuild our life after this? How could I make up for the months of lost income? I felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of it all. My body was broken, my spirit was broken, and the future seemed uncertain. I had no answers, only questions. But despite all of this, one thought kept me going. My girls, they were still my reason to keep fighting, even when I felt like giving up. I couldn't let them see me fall apart. I couldn't let them feel the weight of my fear. I had to be strong for them, even if I didn't know how to be. In the darkest moment of my life, I had to hold on to one thing: hope. Hope that somehow we would make it through this. Hope that I would find a way to rebuild. Hope that my daughters would still have a future, no matter what had happened. The accident, the pain, the debt, it all felt like too much. But I couldn't give up. I couldn't let the darkness consume me. I had to keep going for them. I had to find a way to survive, to heal, and to rebuild. I didn't know how, but I knew I couldn't do it alone. As I lay in that hospital bed, the fear gripped me like nothing I had ever felt before. I was in pain, physical pain, so intense it clouded my thoughts, but it was the emotional pain that felt even more suffocating. My body was broken, my leg in a cast, the constant ache reminding me of the accident every time I shifted. But it wasn't just my leg that was shattered, it was everything. I had always been strong. I had always been the one who took care of everything, who shouldered the weight of my family's survival. I had always been the one who made sure my daughters had food, shelter, and everything they needed. But now, here I was, lying in a hospital bed, helpless, unable to even move on my own, and the weight of that helplessness threatened to crush me. The guilt was overwhelming. My mind raced as I thought about my daughters, their faces in my mind's eye. Emma, the responsible one, always looking after her younger sisters, probably trying to figure out how to take care of me now. Grace, full of energy and always trying to bring light into our lives, probably too scared to smile, too scared to laugh. And little Luna, so innocent, so unaware of the severity of the situation, yet clinging to me like she always had, her tiny hands reaching out to comfort me. I wanted to reach out to them, to hold them, to tell them everything would be okay. But I couldn't even hold myself together, let alone them. How could I be their mother, their provider, when I couldn't even get out of bed? I had always prided myself on being self-sufficient, on being strong, on being the rock for my girls. Now, I felt like I was drowning in guilt. How could I let them see me like this? How could I look at them, knowing I was failing them, knowing that I couldn't do the one thing that had always come naturally to take care of them? I had always been the one to make sure our bills were paid, the rent was covered, the pantry was stocked, and the laundry was done. I had always been the one who put them to bed at night, who read them stories, who kissed them goodnight. But now, everything was falling apart. I was unable to work, unable to do anything that I had once done with ease. Every day in that hospital felt like a reminder how fragile everything was. I couldn't help but wonder how long we would last without my income. How long could we survive without me working? How long would it take before the bills piled up and we were evicted from the apartment I had fought so hard to keep? The fear of losing everything, of watching my daughters suffer because of my inability to provide, consumed me. What kind of mother would I be if I couldn't protect them from the world? What kind of mother would I be if I couldn't make sure they were safe and cared for? The thought of losing our home was terrifying. It wasn't just a place to live, it was our sanctuary, our safe space. It was the place where my daughters had their memories, their routines, and the only home they had ever known. The thought of losing that stability was unbearable. I felt hopeless, defeated, and the darkness in my heart seemed impossible to shake. The guilt I felt was almost physical. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my daughters' faces, saw the worry in their eyes, and it broke me. I could feel the weight of the debt too. The $20,000 I owed from the accident, the damage to the luxury store, was another burden on my shoulders that I couldn't escape. The fear of how I would pay that debt haunted me. I had never been in debt like this before. I had always worked hard to avoid it, to live within my means. But now it felt like an insurmountable mountain. How could I ever repay that money when I couldn't even leave my hospital bed? The future seemed so uncertain. The fear of financial ruin, of losing everything, was consuming me. And what would happen to my girls if I couldn't get back to work? How would they cope without me? The guilt was overwhelming, but it wasn't just the fear of losing our home or the debt that kept me up at night. It was the fear of not being able to be the mother they needed me to be. My daughters needed me, and I couldn't be there for them. The physical injury was bad enough, but the emotional toll it took on me was even worse. I had always been the one to hold them when they were scared, to comfort them when they were sad. But now I was the one who needed comfort. I felt like a failure. The emotional weight of it all was too much to bear, and I couldn't see a way out. The loneliness I felt in that hospital room was suffocating. There were visitors, of course, doctors, nurses, people from the community who had heard about the accident, but none of them could understand the emotional toll it was taking on me. They couldn't understand the fear that was consuming me, the deep sense of helplessness that overwhelmed me every time I thought about my daughters. I felt disconnected from everything and everyone. I was physically there, but emotionally, I was somewhere else, lost in a fog of fear, guilt, and hopelessness. But even in the darkest moments, there was a flicker of hope, a tiny voice in the back of my mind telling me not to give up, not yet. That voice, faint as it was the only thing that kept me going. I wasn't ready to give up. I couldn't give up. I had to keep fighting for my daughters. They were depending on me. I had always been the one who showed them strength, and I couldn't let them see me fall apart. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I had to find a way to rebuild my life, to heal, and to provide for them again. Even though the future seemed uncertain, even though I didn't have the answers, I knew that I couldn't let the darkness swallow me. The road ahead would be long, and the challenges would be great, but I couldn't give up. I owed it to my daughters to fight for a future where they didn't have to worry about whether they would have enough food, enough clothes, or enough love. I couldn't let this accident be the end of our story. I didn't know how we would get through it, but I knew we would. I would find a way. I had to. I started to focus on the small victories, the fact that I was still alive, that I had the support of kind strangers, that my girls were healthy. These small moments of gratitude became my lifeline. They were what kept me going, what kept the flicker of hope alive in my heart. It wasn't easy. The fear and guilt were still there, but they didn't define me. They were part of my story, but they wouldn't be the end of it. I had to believe that. For them. For me. As I lay in that hospital bed, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty, I couldn't help but wonder how I would face the future. But through the darkness, I found a flicker of hope, a hope that my daughters would give me the strength to keep going. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but I knew one thing: I had to keep fighting for them. No matter how broken I felt, I had to rebuild. I had to rise. This was just the beginning of our journey, and no matter what came next, I wasn't ready to give up. Thank you for being a part of my story. Stay with me as we move forward into the next chapter of this journey.